which I think does great books, looking books. Great books too, but they're so very pretty.
Closer.
Okay.
Mic close.
Oh, yeah. Tell me, is this enough? Do you hear me? Okay.
It wasn't on, so it should be good now. I didn't turn it on. Sorry.
This book consists of writing I've done throughout my career, from almost the beginning to quite current work. It integrates my intellectual work with the values that I've always been committed to: freedom, justice, and equality. I've been a political activist all my life, implicitly Marxist, before I read any Marx. I went to the City College of New York, which was free at the time, a marvelous public good, quite rare in the US, from which I benefited immensely. In graduate school, I studied philosophy of mind and metaphysics. Analytic philosophy in those days was rigidly differentiated from history and social theory. My political activity was outside of philosophy. Political friends sometimes often asked me how I could do that bourgeois philosophy, but they didn't know, they couldn't say how it was bourgeois. I thought of it as essentially apolitical. It wasn't until I was teaching at Wisconsin in the early 70s and radical and feminist philosophers were beginning to organize, many also from an analytic background, that I began to connect my political interests and my intellectual interests. This was not good for my academic career, and I was denied tenure at Wisconsin and again at Rutgers University. However, Rutgers had a union. We fought it and eventually won, got tenure. But I was more estranged from the academy than ever, and my writing over the years reflects it. The first of 4 sections of the book is on modes of production. All my work is implicitly grounded in the concept of a mode of production. Based on Marx's materialist, social, and historical perspective, the concept of a mode of production is the key to his method and his way of understanding the histories of human societies. In Exploitation and Modes of Production, written on the 150th anniversary of Capital's publication, I explored the breadth, flexibility, and usefulness of the concept. By no means is the concept restricted to the economy, nor is it equivalent to the more vague notion of social formation. There are many stages and varieties of capitalism, but they all create certain potentialities and limits that are rooted in the nature of the capitalist mode of production. I made clear first that it was not only capitalism that was exploitative, a point that is frequently misunderstood because Marx's focus in Capital was capitalism, but second, that it's the particular process through which exploitation occurs in the capitalist mode of production that holds the key to understanding the system as a whole. In, quote, varieties of Marxist-Feminist theories, I discuss dual systems theories of capitalism and patriarchy versus a one-system model, my view, the popular concept of intersectionality, and explain how we can account for many kinds of oppression within capitalism, but in a non-reductive way, using what I call a framework model. In Sex, Work, and Capitalism, I continue this idea of a framework, by which I mean that the capitalist mode of production sets the terms, if you will, of degrees of freedom and unfreedom, again, in historically particular ways, different from other modes of production. Here I explain how the ways in which sex work is and is not different from other kinds of work within capitalism, bringing together Marx's discussion of exploited and free work and feminist insights into sexuality and power. The question of exploitation within capitalism was at the heart of what came to be called the domestic labor debate, in which feminists sought to understand how the unpaid labor of housework, child care, and so on contributed to the social reproduction of the working class, and whether or not that labor could be best understood as exploited labor in capitalism, and if so, whether by men or by capitalists. The paper, Women's Work, in quotes, the Family and Capitalism, remains relevant today because it is women who still primarily do unpaid care work after 50 years of feminist organizing. This fact has given rise to a new current within Marxist feminism, social reproduction feminism. And I went to a very interesting panel this morning on 3 books on that. The final paper in this section takes us to democratic socialism, which is conceived as rational democratic planning, a mode of production which would not be exploitative. In the second section on rationality, I critique the abstract individualist model of rationality that's dominant in economics and philosophy. This model defines rational behavior as individual behavior that aims to maximize utility. Based on this model of rationality, philosophers have argued against Marx's claim that revolution is a rational act, purporting to show that his stance is incoherent. In the article, Rationality and Revolution, I defend Marx and demonstrate that this individualist model of rationality is a prime example of what Marx defined as ideology. Individualist accounts are more than ever in need of a social alternative given the climate catastrophe on our doorstep. The COVID pandemic only reinforced the patent stupidity of relying on an individual model of society. Quote, for a sustainable future, the centrality of public goods argues for the necessity of reconceiving the concepts of security, property, and rationality, moving away from an individualist perspective to a social model, stressing the importance of taking public goods or commons as the default rather than private property. This leads us to rational democratic planning, the only way we can stop the ecological crisis. This is the article that I expected Hilary would have concentrated on because we both wrote for Socialist Register, and I cited her work several times in the article. The third section is on freedom, which is discussed in 2 areas of academic philosophy. Metaphysics, where determinism and free will are debated, and social and political philosophy. Individualism is appropriate in the former domain, where the question is, can a free act be determined? In free will and a Marxist concept of natural wants, unquote, I bring the 2 together, that is metaphysics and social political philosophy. I discuss a popular theory known as compatibilism, which argues that acts can be both free and determined, but whether or not they are so depends on what they're determined by. If the causes are the agent's wants and beliefs, then the act is free. But this is insufficient. It would not be free if those wants and beliefs were caused by brainwashing. A Marxist analysis of capitalist society, of what causes our wants and beliefs, shows that most acts done in capitalist society are not so very different, are on a scale closer to a brainwashing. Freedom is always a matter of degree. but we want our acts and our society to be as free as possible. I extend this argument in Against Capitalism as Theory and Reality. Defenders of capitalism as the best political economic system overall usually do so on the grounds of its greater efficiency at producing material well-being or its greater freedom. Concentrating on the latter, which I did because this was originally part of a book with Ann Cudd, and she's a libertarian free. Anyway. Concentrating on the question of its greater freedom, key questions I pose are whether capitalism is more free compared to what alternatives, and with respect to what, and which women are we looking at? Exploring freedom involves important philosophical issues, such as the idea of self-ownership, thought by some to be the foundation of freedom, the difference between empowerment and power, and the question of whether poverty renders one less free, as I think, or just less capable, as liberal philosophers often claim. The final section addresses issues related to human nature and so-called women's nature, discussions of which have always been a mixture of science and political assumptions and values. I argue that nature is a theory-laden term and that the question should rather be put, are there sex-differentiated natures, since there's no reason to take men as the norm? If there are, we should conceptualize them as dynamic rather than static, and socially constructed rather than innate. In A Marxist Theory of Women's Nature, I extended this approach, drawing on Marxist theory, which stresses the importance for people's lives and their very natures of the mode of production in which they live and their place within it. Most importantly, their labor and the social relations in which they are embedded. Women might be said to have distinct nature, given women's distinctive labor, taking care of children and others, but not all women would share this nature. Gendered natures, being socially constructed and historically evolving, can change. The next paper, Humankinds, compares the concepts of human nature, gender, and race, which have all been used to explain and to justify existing hierarchies of class, sex, and race. While the biological determinist assumptions underlying the claims of inevitable hierarchy are all false, there are important and interesting differences in how these social categories are related to biology. I contend that Marx had a theory of relatively invariant, biologically based human nature, while also holding to historically specific forms of human nature. This is due to the fact that human beings are embodied physically, in particular that our brains are neuroplastic, and that they're also affected by the social relations in which we live. Thus, the possibility of change and variability and liberation is dependent on, but not determined by, our biological constitution. Well, there are two sexes that most people fall into, which is important for biological theory. There is no necessary connection between sex and gender. Though the concepts of gender and race are similar in how they have functioned ideologically, race is different in an important respect. There is a biological fact of sex, whereas race is a wholly historical, social, political construct and has profound harmful effects on those defined as non-white. In short, it's racism that creates the group that needs to struggle against it. Alienation, Freedom, and Human Nature is the final article. In it, I explain Marx's theory of alienation found in Capital and not just the economic and philosophical manuscripts, that along with exploitation is one of the evils of capitalism that cannot be eliminated. Alienation takes several forms in capitalism. Alienation from the product of one's labor, from the process of labor, from other people, and from the fundamental character of the human species, which is free, conscious activity. I concentrate on this latter aspect of alienation because it's the most complicated and also the most controversial. The reason Marx credits certain variants of human nature as more truly human is that they were formed and expressed in conditions of freedom rather than oppressive social relations. The final aspect is alienation from other people, which brings out that Marx's vision of social equality combines community and individuality. To conclude, if Marx is right that most people have enormous unrealized potential, which, if realized, would make them happier and more fulfilled, and that this realization can only happen in an egalitarian and free society. This is a powerful moral argument in favor of such a society and in favor of encouraging the traits of empathy, solidarity, and reciprocity necessary to achieve it. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. Lillian? Okay, hi, everyone. I want to first thank Nancy for putting together this volume. I had known some parts of Nancy's work before, but I really felt like reading the whole book. There are 12 essays in it. I think you can see from Nancy's presentation that it ranges very widely and actually forms something of a comprehensive view that is internally consistent. And I think that sometimes with like analytical philosophers, we might not always see the whole vision all at once because it's an article-based way of writing, intervening in different debates at different times. So this was a really, I think, enriching experience for me. I have basically three categories of comments, and all of them are just asking Nancy to expand on different elements of her thought. And I think so I have comments about the domestic labor, on women's nature, and then finally about freedom. And I think the freedom comment, I will probably be expanding a little more, beyond the boundaries of the book, but it's just, again, an invitation to think more, push it in different directions. So on the first issue of domestic labor, in the beginning of the book, Nancy intervenes in the domestic labor debate regarding whether domestic labor is productive labor. In like brief summary, okay, that there was like a lot published about this. Proponents said that it was because domestic labor produces something in the value chain, okay, that is critical to capital accumulation, that this is why it was productive in the Marxist sense. Often this argument had a moral tinge to it, like in the sense that people use value creation and being valuable socially as interchangeable. And Nancy argued that domestic labor is not value producing in the Marxist sense, and that it is critical to understand this point to gain a realistic view of where power is concentrated in capitalist societies. And this is a matter of strategic importance for the socialist left. I think that she's right about this. I kind of feel that this is one of those debates that was settled. How I do want to ask you to relate maybe this older debate to the newer debates about social reproduction theory and whether it learned the right lessons from the domestic labor debate. This isn't really a fishing question. It's just genuine curiosity. Social reproduction theory tends to redefine a lot of human activity as labor. And it focuses on how a now expanded concept of reproductive labor is functional to capitalist stability, reproduction, accumulation, and so on. And I'm curious what you think about the direction that these theoretical arguments have taken. There are different strands. So it's an invitation to say more. One of the most compelling essays in the volume is the chapter on women's nature. You argue that sexual difference is both real and politically meaningful, but you address the worries that people have when they recoil from the idea that there are two sexes or that gender may track them. In your view, sex is a cluster concept that is useful for biological theory. It's not a set of necessary and jointly sufficient conditions. And one thing that I thought after reading this essay is that it's been misleading to think about sex as a logical category instead of as a biological one. How biologists think about evolutionary biology accounts for human behavior and change does not amount to biological determinism, in fact. So that's kind of one of the interesting takeaways from the essay. And at the beginning of that, you say that this view is controversial, but is common sense to you. Nancy says that. And I think this is, I read this and felt very refreshed by this. I'm in complete agreement with your view, and it made this essay sort of edifying for me. I'd like to know how you think this argument matters politically, since it strikes me as important. At one point, you argue that the critical force of social constructionism regarding gender actually decreases if everything turns out to be social. And I'd like to ask if you could elaborate on that point, because you showed, I think that you said some things in the essays that were suggestive, but maybe what you take to be the payoff there would be good. I suspect that the answer has something to do with a distinctively socialist feminist conception of freedom, that you might not think it's possible to achieve this form of freedom, which has to do with Marx's notion of human flourishing, if we neglect the historical biological reality that there are sex-differentiated psychological and affective traits, i.e. gender. And the materialist feminist contribution is to analyze the political organization of sexual difference. So the reason that this isn't a determinist view is that you're talking about the material conditions that put people in relation to one another, and so there's a prior thing in the causal chain prior to sexual difference as such. So I think this sort of macro, so it might not be possible to do that so well if we deny that it's real and politically salient. And I'm wondering if something like this is right. So maybe you don't, that's not how you're thinking about it. But that was what I was kind of grasping at while I was reading the essay. Okay, the third category is freedom. And I want to expand in theoretical directions where I think Marxist feminism needs further development. I think your focus is on a mode of production critique of capitalism. And I think there's been a revived interest in this point of view insofar as there's more new writing about social contradiction, crisis, and their relationship to care work, social reproduction, et cetera, et cetera. And I think this sort of macro-social analysis is very important. And at the same time, I think that state theory is very important. And I think there's a lot of good state theory in Marxism. Some state theory I'm quite convinced by, but I don't know if I don't think that I have a very strong sense of what a socialist feminist state theory looks like. And not just in capitalist regimes, for reasons that you actually suggest in your book. So the reason this would be politically important is obviously you're dealing with issues of resistance and transition under capitalism, but also critical analysis of non-capitalist regimes. So when describing the wrong turn that the Soviet and Chinese development took with respect to women's liberation, you point out that these regimes did a lot to promote gender equality at first, but changed their tune when they thought they needed to for development reasons. And there are clear limits when women depend for their freedom on the state's interest in it. So another thing that makes me think this is important is that we are living in a time of increased. There's been a very prolonged crisis of welfare states in the advanced capitalist world. Retrenchment has had very serious effects on women and their dependents, children, old people, elderly, and this feminist critiques of this situation are many and numerous, but further welfare state retrenchment in the rich capitalist economies has created a lot of new political interest in expanding existing welfare states to win back what has been lost and protect women and dependents from the market. So I'm thinking recently about a debate that was held in Jacobin about pre-distribution versus redistribution. So somebody made an argument about the virtues of pre-distribution, which basically, it's a new way of talking about the balance of class forces, but in a more technical kind of like economic sense. Like there are different policies that actually reduce inequality prior to taxation. Okay, and one of the biggest advocates for the welfare state on the American left, like came out at this like swinging and was just like kind of had a temper tantrum about the idea that redistribution is not the answer. We have to have the welfare state and so on. So because there's a lot of attacks on the welfare state, there's also a lot of anxiety about defending it. And I find this to be a very difficult position to be in because analytically, like Marxists and socialists tend to think that pre-distributive policies are like better because they build class power and give you more leverage and, allow you to influence the overall, state of the economy and hopefully, beyond that. But I think that with the absence of that kind of political strength, it's very difficult to argue against the redistributive policies. And in fact, we want more of them. So I don't know how to resolve this, but I think that this is a dilemma that some of the more abstract socialist feminists thinking about what we would like to see in the future doesn't quite we're in quite a difficult position. And I think this should be appreciated. And therefore, what I perceive is actually a lot of deep ambivalence about this situation among feminist thinkers. People will criticize and condemn, but they will not actually say they don't support. Okay, so I think I'd like to ask you, what do you think is the most fundamental critique of the welfare state from a Marxist-feminist point of view? Does it have a role in feminist politics? Beyond the state, a lot of your book is about freedom and economic planning. And I know that you've had debates with people in sort of left-wing philosophy circles about, planning and alternative models. So I'd like to know if you have, ideas about how to promote a distinctively democratic socialist kind of development. In my view, these questions are related because answering them helps. Like these seem like technical, political, economic questions, but it helps Marxist feminists to articulate what their vision of freedom is. So what is the relationship between rational economic planning and gender equality? Surely there are some elements of socialization that will occur with reproductive labor. And then, what are the most compelling to you visions? Finally, I think answers to these questions, like in future research and future thinking, would also help Marxist feminists to engage constructively in debate with non-socialist feminists who focus much more on the uses and abuses of state power, or post-colonial feminists who are skeptical of development in general. Not always and everywhere, but there is a kind after the decline, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the failures of neoliberal development models, there is a skepticism of development. And it strikes me that socialist feminists actually don't agree with that skepticism wholeheartedly, but obviously capitalist development is something they are opposed to. So we have to have, what is the, anyway. So I'm not sure if we can settle all of the political disagreements that exist in these debates. I suspect that some of them are just genuine disagreements about vision and so on. But I also suspect that democratic socialist planning, development, whatever you want to call it, could still have more political legitimacy than capitalist development if it happens democratically. And that we can make that argument to our allies, and this is, I think I'm interested in that problem. So I don't know if Nancy was going to respond directly or I don't know what we're going to do next, but that's all my comments.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Yes. No, first of all, can you hear me?
You need to press push. No.
Yeah. Can you hear me now? Yes. All right. So first of all, I have to say I am really happy and very honored that Nancy asked me to be commenting on her book. I have to say, since I learned to read in English, actually Nancy's work has been really incredibly important for me. I remember I cherished my book, The Socialist Feminist Project, my copy of The Socialist Feminist Project, which for those of you who don't know is a wonderful collection of essays that Nancy edited. It's a contemporary reader in theory and politics. And I was just looking again now, scrolling the table of contents, and it has wonderful essays. Really, it's the pantheon of socialist Marxist feminism. Angela Davis, Anne Ferguson, Denise Candioti, Chandra Mohanty. I was really, I mean, it's incredible. And really, Nancy gave us this incredibly precious work as I and others like me were beginning to familiarize ourselves with Marxist feminism. I also became later more familiar with her work on Marxism and human nature, which to my mind, actually Nancy's work is one of the few that really deals from a feminist point of view, from a Marxist feminist point of view, with this issue of what is human nature in Marx. And so I also found that incredibly useful in my own attempt to understand how we can conceptualize gender using Marx and the Marxist feminist framework. But maybe I will say a little bit more on this later. So this collection specifically, I think it's great that you brought together all these essays in this book. There is a coherence. They are incredibly rich. They give this historical depth. There is the sense of the period in which they were written, but I was also struck by how incredibly relevant all of these discussions are still today. So in that sense, this is really a wonderful collection that is going to be incredibly useful. I also have to say something about your writing style, in the sense that Nancy is incredibly clear, and in that sense, I think you, as you said, you are trained, if I understood correctly, in analytic philosophy. That feels here, but I think I say this in a positive way because it's precisely because there is a certain clarity and way of deconstructing, reconstructing the argument that, well, in a way, we find more, I have to say, sometimes in that tradition. So in that sense, I think this is really, I found it really useful. I will say a few things really that I personally find particularly useful. So the first part, as Lillian said already, the book is divided into these three parts: mode of production, rationality, and human nature, and freedom. So the mode of production, I really like how you emphasize the importance of the concept of mode of production and how we need to understand it as different from the concept of system. And I personally, as a sociologist, find this particularly useful because we sociologists live in the world of systems and functionalism, and is one of the struggles that we have as Marxist sociologists, actually, to valorize this concept and this idea behind the mode of production, which allows, among other things, really to understand and conceptualize the different temporalities of exploitation, real and formal subsumption that continue to be present in the world and in different regions and geographies. So in that sense, I really think it's really important to emphasize the centrality of this concept in Marxism, but also I would say more generally for the social sciences. In that sense, I also think these conceptualization is particularly useful when you discuss the dual systems theory. And I guess for many perhaps for many people here, this is really such an old debate. I don't know how much many people are familiar here with this debate, but really, again, it's a very formative debate for Marxist feminism, one that we might think we have, in a way, perhaps overcome, but I'm not entirely actually sure about that. And I will explain in a second why I think it's still quite important to, from my point of view, and as you also do criticize dual system analysis, you apply your critique specifically to the concept of a domestic mode of production that had been put forward by some materialist feminists like Christine Delphi in France. And again, for those of you who are not familiar with this debate, the idea really was, feminists experienced a lot of sexism within Marxist socialist circles back in the 60s and in the 70s. And so some of Marxist feminists decided to say, okay, so maybe there are really two explanatory frameworks. One is feminism that allows us to make sense of patriarchy and sexism, and the other one is capitalist exploitation that allows us to make sense of class exploitation, and for which we use class analysis. So the two are different. The patriarchy and capitalism are two different systems. Here, the dual system. And can we marry them? This was really the debate. And a lot of incredibly useful, actually, discussions came from that. In a way, I'm always a little bit jealous of those years, because you had, these strong disagreements, but always really they were so incredibly useful, and the level of theoretical depth was really astounding. So in that sense, one of the positions was, for example, by Christine Delphi, that the family, the household, the private household is a distinct mode of production in which women are exploited, including by their working class husbands. And so in a way, it was an idea of sisterhood based on the idea that women are united by this exploitation that they experience in the private households, to which obviously, particularly Black feminists in the United States responded, well, there is more solidarity between Black men and women than there is solidarity between Black and white men, for example. So we can really not talk about solidarity or common experiences of exploitation on this basis. So again, I think you show here very well how we need Marxist concept of mode of production also in order to criticize really and to explain why the idea of the domestic mode of production in that sense is not tenable. So on rationality, this is also, I will move on to the other part of the book, which is the one, as I said, on rationality. Here, I am not familiar entirely with a lot of discussions on rationality, Marxism and rationality, at least those in philosophy, at least the way you discuss it here. But I was really struck by the way in which your discussion of rationality contra individualistic notions, like Machiavelli means end realpolitik, or maximization of utility in economic utilitarian sense, is really useful to bring forward Marxist discussions on morality and revolution. And this is in fact the aim of Nancy. So she discusses rationality here to counter a position according to which revolutionary action is not rational, is highly irrational, because it's doomed to fail, and therefore there is really no reason why people should rationally engage in a revolutionary action. And here I think Nancy shows incredibly well you touch upon at least a couple of very important discussions in my view. One is the issue of the relationship between means and ends, or instrumental rationality. And you show very well how this is is not just rationality to core, but is a specific kind of capitalist instrumental rationality that sees the world discretely, in the sense that it sees the world in a way in which means are disconnected from the ends, and people are disconnected one from the other. And I think, Trotsky wrote beautiful words on criticizing this Machiavellian means-ends rationality. Also Hannah Arendt, for those who are familiar with these discussions, criticizes that. So I think you bring these elements very importantly into this discussion on rationality. But I particularly like the way in which you counter the idea that that revolution is irrational, by saying, actually, if we even look at these more individual level, the problem with these ideas of instrumental rationality is that they don't see people coming together. They see only discrete individuals. And in fact, contra this idea, you say, and I'm quoting here, one of the crucial changes brought by collective activity is the trust workers develop that others will join with them and not leave them out on a limb. The more experience they have of common sharing of risks, the more confidence and more basis for confidence each person has that acting in a collective way will produce the best results, and hears that it is rational to take the risk. Organization can help to sustain this trust. And I thought this is beautifully written, and as you can see, very clear. She's explaining very, very clearly how, in fact, when people come together, we don't go from nothing to revolution. There is a whole process of people struggling, perhaps initially in smaller, in confined spaces, or in small scale type of struggles that then can become bigger, precisely because people learn to struggle together. And that's, I think, incredibly important to show, these different rationality. But I also thought it's so important to remember the kind of rationality that we are talking about here in connection to the issue of, perhaps I should say, political necessity. And here I am thinking of, the socialist stagist approaches, according to which, it's really a kind of philosophy of history ideas, according to which capitalism will go through different stages, and different countries will also have to undergo different stages. Again, whenever we think we are over with these dated ideas, they actually resurface continuously. And here I am again thinking how this discussion on revolutionary rationality is connected to those discussions on the necessity of revolution. And I'm glad that Peter Hallward is here, because I was actually going to use his words on the Haitian Revolution that I always use. I have them ready because I have them in slides for my students. I always use them for when I discuss the Haitian Revolution. And so Peter writes, and I think is very relevant here, the achievement of Haitian independence reminds us that politics need not always proceed as the art of the possible. Haitian independence brought to an end one of the most profoundly improbable sequences in all of world history. The Haitian Revolution is a particularly dramatic example of the way in which historical necessity emerges only retrospectively. Those who refrain from action until the full strategic import of the moment becomes clear will never act, which I think is incredibly beautifully put and so true. And it shows in a way the alternative rationality of revolution. Finally, I'm really going to close here. I feel I've taken too much time, but I have perhaps more questions than really comments on the last part of your book on human nature, women's nature. Well, I guess I would like to hear you on current discussions on transgender issues here, because I think you make clear how in your reading the body and our human bodies, if I understand you correctly, are sexed, and they are kind of material bodily infrastructures that can also lead to different psychologies, but also how we need to understand all of these historically and how all of these can in fact change and has changed historically. So I guess, I mean, in this country, as you probably know, we have a huge discussion at the moment. There are also some, they claim to be left-wing feminists that are engaged in these discussions. And I was just wondering, how do you, how would you react and respond to these crazy, in my view, discussions that we're having at the moment in Britain on transgender rights? Thank you.
Thank you. Nancy, you
Okay.
have some time to respond.
I'll just respond a little bit to Sarah because, sorry. I'll just respond a little bit to Sarah because it's the first I've heard of it, heard her comments, which I appreciate very much. But I'm not as good at ad-libbing as I used to be. So I just want to say that all of you socialist, Marxist, feminists in the audience should feel free to participate, and we'll have a discussion of it if you have something to say that I don't say. Sarah mentioned the Socialist Feminist Project that I did in early 2000 something or other. And it was a collection, first of all, I had 4 mothers and fathers, like Rosa Luxemburg and Edward Carpenter and, so forth, just to show that it wasn't something that just arrived. It's been there for a long time. But anyway, most of my contributors were not as famous as Angela Davis or anything. They were people who never necessarily mentioned socialist feminists or thought of themselves in those terms, but in practice, what they were doing, they were analyzing specific areas where they were brought in class and gender. So I thought that was useful. And the same, that's a little, I'm sorry, I forgot what I was going to say. Anyway, so far as the relevance today, that's part of why I did it. That I'm in a socialist feminist reading philosophers group based in MIT, and sometimes you find yourself discussing the same stuff, the same old stuff, and I think I sent around a paper a few times because I can't elaborate so well, and there's only so much time in a discussion that you can do, and people found it useful. So we're sort of reinventing the wheel in many cases. About my writing style, I was very influenced by George Orwell. Politics in the English Language was a formative piece, and I can't stand bullshit. I can't stand when I can't understand it. I just turn off. And as for dual systems theory, one question when you read about it, I mean, it's attractive because there is still a lot of sexism, in Marxist circles or male circles, and which this conference is kind of male dominated. Anyway, but especially in the United States, you think, why only 2? And so some of socialist dual systems theorists like Ann Ferguson adds 3 for racism. And, it starts to get sort of like pluralism, just that. And that's not a coherent theory. So I tried to show how there can be all kinds of different systems of, if you want to call system, anyway, kind of oppressions, but within the framework of capitalism, which at some points are more salient than others. So far as Delphi and the exploitation in the family, sometimes men seem to exploit women, but it depends. There are women who earn more than men, and women exploit at work, exploit men, and it depends. But we don't have to say that men exploit women in the family to recognize that they benefit, most of them. They benefit when women do most of the housework. So you can say that just as white people benefit, even if they don't exploit or deliberately oppress Black people. So that's one question. About rationality, I don't remember what I wanted to say. About trans, to be honest, I really don't want to say anything about it. I just want to say I have a footnote which said, I wrote Humankind in 1991, before transgender and transsexual issues were commonly discussed. Today, trans philosophy and and studies are found in many academic departments. While I believe that my denial that sex determines gender was fundamentally compatible with thinking about transsexual, transgender issues and affirming the legitimacy of transgender identities, when putting this collection, I was unsure how what I had written would accord with current language and sensibilities. For useful current articles, anyway, I cite some articles and books. So that's pretty much all I can say at the moment. As for Lillian, I had a little more time to think about it and write some answers. The first question about domestic labor, whether it's productive, in a broad sense, of course. But in Marxist theory, productive has a different meaning, and it's not productive. To quote Rosa Luxemburg, from the standpoint of capital, the dancer in a cafe who makes a profit for her employer with her legs is a productive working woman, while all the toil of the women and mothers of the proletariat within the four walls of the home is considered unproductive work. This sounds crude and crazy, but it is an accurate reflection of the crudeness and craziness of today's economic order. Why did he restrict? Why did Marx restrict the notion in this way? Because to understand capitalism requires understanding what's productive from the point of view of capitalism as a specific mode of production. He says, quote, this is from Capital. The distinction from other kinds of labor is, however, of the greatest importance, since this distinction expresses precisely the specific form of labor on which the whole capitalist mode of production and capital itself is based. Labor, anyway, so that's why. Lillian's question is an interesting one about whether contemporary social reproduction theory has learned the right lessons. I'm not sure. I don't think I'm an expert on social reproduction theory. It depends on which theorist you're talking about. But I think those who call themselves social reproduction theorists recognize that domestic labor is not productive of surplus value, as the wages for housework theorists said. But maybe sometimes they are grouped together. But I think to call a lot of human activity reproductive labor in a broad sense is correct. And much of it is even productive in Marxist sense, that is, when it's for wages. Unionized healthcare workers in capitalist hospitals would be very important strategically. But much of reproductive labor is still unwaged domestic labor, done mostly by women. Is it as important strategically as other kinds of labor, wage labor? Not as important, definitely, but not therefore unimportant. It can change the way we think about it and maybe lead to social movements pressuring for change. Women's nature. You say that I say that sexual difference is both real and politically meaningful. I'm not sure what you mean by politically meaningful. I don't think it is politically meaningful. You asked me to elaborate on my argument that the critical force of social reconstructionism regarding general, sorry, let me start again. You asked me to elaborate on my argument that the critical force of social reconstructionism regarding gender actually decreases if everything turns out to be social. I think it's clearest in the case of race. What I said is that it's a concept that is wholly politically, socially, historically important. I say that racism creates the group that needs to struggle against it. I think this is profoundly important politically. But if everything is socially constructed, then this critique of race as socially constructed loses its importance. You bring up state theory. Here's where I most miss Hilary, who's a real expert on state theory. And you ask about Marxist-Feminist critiques of welfare states and state socialist or Stalinist societies. Basically, the critique or my critique is that both are examples of socialism from above as opposed to socialism from below, to use Hal Draper's distinction. Welfare states can be wholly from above, paternalistic and coercive, but sometimes they may be responsive to social movements and the labor movement. Best case scenario would be if these movements manage to influence and even control the state institutions, say childcare. Like, for example, if Zoran Mandami, just elected mayor of New York City, manages to get free childcare, which is one of his key demands, and childcare movements take control of running it, that would be very exciting. Hilary reports that something like this happened here in London under Ken Livingstone's administration. Marxist feminists always need to stress the importance of democratic control. There are risks to almost everything, and trade-offs have to be made. No one is in a better position to make these decisions than the people most directly affected. To take an extreme example, the nuclear accidents at Bhopal and Chernobyl remind us of the dangers of undemocratic control, whether from public ownership, as with Chernobyl, or private, as with Bhopal. That's all. I don't think I have